They are peas in a pod. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. Twin dictators who rode the same tide of European discontent to total control of their respective nations, they now threaten both their own people and the outside world in a way that is almost unparalleled in history. Hitler, of course, is well known, but Italian Premier Mussolini, very much the junior partner in the European Axis, is less familiar. In many ways, however, it was Mussolini who paved the way for Hitler, who showed the Nazi tyrant the path from obscurity to power. Mussolini, like Hitler, was a veteran of World War I who returned to a nation descending into chaos. Unlike the Germans, the Italians were not a defeated nation. But throughout Europe, historic tides were building. The Great Depression, which didn't strike the United States until the 1930s, crippled Europe in the early 1920s. The elite running the continent showed little concern for the plight of the unemployed and starving. From the East, Marxism and its descendant communism promised the increasingly disgruntled masses a kind of paradise where employment was total and want was nothing to fear. Mussolini watched the onset of anarchy as a newspaper writer and editor. Gaining a reputation as a firebrand and enemy of the established order, he was chased out of Austria for his rabble-rousing, and upon landing in his native Italy, quickly thrust himself into the emerging movement of veterans disgruntled with the status quo. In 1919, he created the Fascist Party, ran unsuccessfully for parliament later that year, and, like Hitler, was implicated in a plot to overthrow his country's government. Unlike Hitler, who served jail time for his treason, Mussolini was spared incarceration. The fascists continued to organize and agitate, and in only 3 years, Mussolini went from disgrace to the Italian premier's office. Christened by his followers Il Duce, the leader, he watched with great interest as Hitler seized control of Germany in 1933. One of the Führer's first acts was to arrange a meeting with Il Duce. The two dictators met in Venice in June 1934 and took an almost instant dislike to each other. Hitler was ill at ease in the unfamiliar role of head of state and interpreted Mussolini's preoccupation with grand ceremonial flourishes as a snub. In 1935, spurring the Italian people on with reminders of Rome's lost empire, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. His legions, armed with machine guns and artillery, easily defeated the Ethiopians, fighting largely with weapons that would have been familiar to Julius Caesar. Despite their initial differences, the dictators' mutual interests drew Hitler and Mussolini together. In 1936, they cooperated to provide arms and advisors to aspiring Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. The relationship between the dictators cemented in 1937. Mussolini visited Hitler in Berlin, and for 5 days they romped around Nazi Germany, observing combat maneuvers and parades of goose-stepping soldiers. Hitler took Austria a year later, and Mussolini, virtually alone among European leaders, did not complain. He acquiesced to Hitler's absorption of Czechoslovakia, protested only mildly when the Germans invaded Poland, and when the Nazis invaded France, Mussolini's only reaction was to join in the plunder. They are peas in a pod, Hitler and Mussolini. Twin dictators challenging the world to come stop them. They are only now receiving the world's answer. 19 April 1943. British sailors aboard the submarine Seraph depart from Holy Loch on a mission which may be one of the strangest in military history. Aboard is the highest-ranking dead man ever conscripted into the Royal Marines. In the weeks leading up to this mission, known as Operation Mincemeat, the Allied High Command has been busy planning an attack on what Prime Minister Churchill refers to as the soft underbelly of the Axis, Italy. With the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, Allied planners have turned their attention toward the island of Sicily. Once taken, the island will provide an excellent staging point for attacks on the Italian mainland. This attack is not unexpected by the Axis. And having witnessed the willingness with which the Italian soldiers surrendered in North Africa, Hitler deems it necessary to build up his own troops in Sicily. Allied planners quickly recognized that the rocky crags of Sicily were perfectly suited to a strong defense, and that troops assaulting the island would pay a high price. In spite of this, the plans went forward for the invasion because Allied commanders could find no alternative. That is, until an outlandish plan proposed by Commander Ewan Montagu found its way to the desk of Churchill's Chief of Staff. The plan met with the approval of the Chiefs of Staff, as well as Churchill, and Operation Mincemeat was born. Montagu's plan was to find a body, dress it up as a major in the Royal Marines, place false plans for an Allied invasion of Greece on the body, and see to it that it washed ashore in a place where the Nazis would find it. While some difficulty was encountered in finding an appropriate corpse, one was found, refrigerated, and drafted into the submarine service. Secrecy is of the utmost importance, and most of the men aboard the Seraph do not learn the nature of their bizarre mission even when returning home after releasing Major Martin into the waters off the coast of Huelva, Spain on 30 April. The Chiefs of Staff don't have to wait long to determine if the Major's body has been found, as Spanish officials return him in just a few days, without his attaché case bearing the secret plans. On 13 May, when the case and its contents are returned, British commanders feel certain that the papers have passed under German scrutiny and hope that their plan has worked. Hitler, for one, is convinced that the plans found on Major Martin are genuine and has begun shifting divisions from Sicily to Greece in anticipation of the attack. Mussolini, his instincts right for once, distrusts the plans and argues that forces should be maintained on the island. Hitler responds that the discovered plans simply confirm his earlier suspicion that the Allied attack would come through Greece. His faith is misplaced, or in this case at least, dead men do tell lies. 10 July 1943, the largest armada in history, more than 3,300 ships, arrives off the southern tip of the Italian island of Sicily. Aboard those ships are 7 Allied divisions and the logistical support that the Allies hope will make possible the conquest of the largest island in the Mediterranean. The amphibious force has been gathering for more than a month. It has moved quietly out of ports in North Africa, with supply ships coming from as far as England. A few ships one night, a few more the next, trying to preserve secrecy while heading always to this moment. Awaiting this Allied invasion are more than 200,000 Italian Army regulars and 30,000 Germans. It is a sizable force, but the one thing no one seems sure of is how effective the Italians will be. American intelligence, after interviewing Italians captured in Africa and reviewing reports from Sicilian operatives, is convinced that Mussolini's army would rather switch than fight, and predicts an easy campaign. The plan is strategically simple. The British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, will lead the attack, moving north up the eastern shore of the island. The U.S. Seventh Army, led by General George Patton, will land to Montgomery's left, protecting the British flank and, in Patton's mind, facing the brunt of an Axis counterattack. The invasion is codenamed Operation Husky, and the shipboard forces are preceded only by a relatively small number of airborne troops. But high winds and dark clouds conspire to render the airborne attack useless. More than 3,000 American paratroops land scattered across the island in concentrations too weak to be effective, and the British can place only 12 of more than 140 gliders on target. The few soldiers who survive the landings uninjured are quickly rounded up by Italian patrols. That same weather churns the normally placid Mediterranean. Within sight of Sicily, the ships begin to disgorge their cargo of seasick infantry, many of whom have been bobbing around offshore for more than 2 weeks. The U.S. 7th Army arrives on schedule at the coastal towns of Gela, Licata, and Scoglieti. And though the landings themselves go smoothly, the troops meet a stiff line of resistance a quarter-mile inland. Italian armor. Contrary to intelligence, the Italians do not surrender. They fight. Patton, leading a force of 3 infantry divisions, is a tank commander without tanks of his own. But his infantry improvises well and is able to drive the Italian armor back. To the east, Montgomery, as Patton had predicted, faces only light resistance. He plows through to Syracuse before the Nazis can get more troops to the scene. Hitler, managing the war from the safety of Berlin, has his own doubts about the Italian commitment to his Reich and sends in reinforcements, eventually totaling more than 50,000 men. The German reinforcements slow the push north. The British probe the Germans for a soft spot but find nothing. On 11 July, the Luftwaffe arrives in force, bombing and strafing not just the British, but also the thousands of landing craft supplying the invasion. Gunners on the beach, blinded by magnesium flares and pummeled by the Luftwaffe, open fire on anything in the air, tragically attacking a flight of American C-47s carrying units of the 82nd Airborne Division. Before the firing is brought under control, 23 American aircraft are downed by friendly fire. The quick victory, predicted by intelligence, is not to be. It becomes clear early on that Sicily will be no easy conquest. What is just as clear, and in the long run perhaps more disturbing, is that the Allies have on their hands the beginnings of a first-class rivalry. Patton's disrespect for Montgomery is becoming obvious to their troops. Rather than waiting for Monty to fight his way out from under the Germans, Patton plows gleefully ahead, stretching the bounds of his orders in his quest to best his British counterpart. Montgomery, no less full of himself than Patton, has his forces looking desperately for a way past the Germans so that he might be the one to claim the island for the Allies. That Patton and Monty will let their distaste for each other continue to affect their battle conduct seems inevitable. The only question that remains is whether the competition will help or hinder the Allied war effort. July 1943, Rome. As the Allies continue to advance on the island of Sicily, and the Nazis reply with a flood of reinforcements, the Italian High Command circulates a memorandum declaring that the Axis cause there is lost. A flurry of confidential communiques follows the Italian memo. On 15 July, General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht's operations staff, makes it clear to all around him that he believes the fall of Sicily to be imminent. 3 days later, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini cables Hitler that he, too, thinks that Sicily is lost. Hitler, of course, is enraged by Mussolini's whining and declares that the Luftwaffe and his own racially superior troops will prevail where the inferior Italians failed. As Axis recriminations fly, the fighting on Sicily continues. By 18 July, the basic Allied strategy is clear. General George S. Patton and his American 7th Army drive northwest toward the city of Palermo, entrenching themselves as they go and dividing the island along a north-south line. On the other hand, General Bernard Montgomery and the British 8th Army are heading straight north toward Messina, the town closest to the Italian mainland. The Allied strategy is a compromise worked out by General Dwight Eisenhower, and it is guaranteed to keep no one happy. Montgomery had wanted Patton's army to protect his left flank as he drove north. Patton, on the other hand, wanted to drive to Palermo without slowing down to hold positions in the largely barren center of the island. To Patton, it seemed as if the bulk of his force's time would be spent rounding up straggling Italian prisoners of war, while Montgomery reaped the glory of conquering the island. Patton's feelings are no secret. When British General Sir Harold Alexander, Patton's boss, sends orders commanding the Americans to take Petralia, a small and, Patton believes, insignificant town 45 miles southeast of Palermo, the orders somehow never make it through to the general. Instead, they are sidetracked, allowing the 7th Army to continue forward. In the meantime, the British are having trouble getting around Mount Etna, the volcano that dominates eastern Sicily. Montgomery is, as always, cautious. The Germans are dug into the haunches of Etna, as well as the surrounding hills, and though Montgomery's troops have encircled the enemy, they cannot dislodge him. On the morning of 19 July, the Americans launched their final assault on Palermo. The fight quickly turns into an engineering war, with Germans and Italians blowing bridges and booby-trapping roadways. By 22 July, the 3rd Infantry has taken up positions along the Belice River, southwest of Palermo. As they prepare for battle, they are stunned to hear that the Italians in control of the city have decided not to fight, but to surrender. Patton enters the city with all the pomp of a conquering potentate. He sets up his headquarters in a palace, inviting reporters in to hear of his exploits. Montgomery, on the other hand, remains bogged down at Mount Etna. On 23 July, General Alexander grudgingly admits that Monty and his 8th Army aren't going to break through without some help. He orders Patton and the Americans toward Messina. Patton, whose troops are tired from weeks of forced marches and battle, is thrilled. It is, he tells those around him, a final admission by the arrogant Brits that it is the Americans who have come to their rescue. The Nazi forces that have confounded Montgomery will now face not one, but 2 Allied armies, making it clear to all, even to Hitler himself, that the Axis cause on Sicily is all but lost. With that in mind, on 24 July, Italy's fascist Grand Council meets. Unhappy with Mussolini's tepid response to Hitler's belittling of Italian troops, and distraught at rapid Allied progress on Sicily, the Grand Council removes Mussolini from power. He is imprisoned at the Podgora Carabinieri barracks and allowed no contact with the outside world. The announcement of his resignation brings Italians out into the streets, where they dance late into the night. Mussolini's successor, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, affirms the Italian intent to continue the fight against the Allies. But on 31 July, he sends emissaries to Lisbon, Portugal, to talk peace with the British. Clearly, the rapid progress on Sicily, which made so obvious so early the inevitability of the Allied conquest, now has implications far beyond the island's rocky hills. The war in Europe has changed. The Americans and British have now, in effect, opened the second front the Russians have so long been pushing for, and Hitler has lost his closest ally. All this, and the island has yet to fall. August 1943, Sicily. The American 7th Army, led by General George S. Patton, pushes along the north coast of Sicily toward the town of Messina. For Patton, the push is a journey of personal triumph, the writing of history by a general who believes himself destined for greatness. Patton's destiny is being fulfilled by the American 45th and 1st Infantry Divisions. As Patton rides in parades and issues daring commands, it is the infantry who must slug it out with the Germans. To Patton's east, the British 8th Army, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, is bogged down in the hills around Mount Etna. They face a vast array of German-laid minefields and booby traps. Clearance of the obstacles is virtually impossible, as the Germans rain artillery fire down on the exposed engineers. Patton is, of course, intensely aware of Monty's progress, or lack of it. Since meeting in North Africa, Patton and Monty, despite their positions as Allied generals, have become bitter rivals. There are many reasons for this, most of them having to do with the petty jealousies that so often distract men of great ego. Each general believes his own country superior. Each believes the other to be incompetent. And each wants for himself credit for winning the war. Patton and Monty answer to British Field Marshal Harold Alexander, who, as commander of ground forces in North Africa, came to believe that Americans were sloppy, undisciplined soldiers. In fact, early in the American deployment, they were just that. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower's answer to that problem was Patton, a disciplinarian of the First Order who quickly whipped the Americans into shape. Alexander, however, never really got over his fundamental distrust of the Americans' ability and seemed uniformly to favor his British countrymen, particularly Montgomery. Patton bristled at every perceived British slight and condescension, and by the time the Allies landed on Sicily, he was near the point of open mutiny. Once again, Alexander had planned the battle so that Monty would enjoy the glory and Patton endure the real work. Once again, entreaties to Eisenhower were answered with diplomatic compromises that Patton didn't like and Alexander largely gutted. A student of history, Patton knew that the key to taking Sicily is Messina, the city closest to the Italian mainland. In Alexander's plan, Monty ended up assigned a straight shot at Messina, while Patton was relegated to fighting the long way around the island and guarding the British flank. Now, however, Patton is in a position to arrive first at Messina, claiming his role as hero while vindicating once and for all the American fighting man. Patton urges his troops onward, and the men of the Big Red 1 and 45th Infantry claw slowly forward, battling through enemy minefields, past blown bridges, every obstacle a potential ambush. The casualties are not horrendous, but they are constant. Brave men, Patton calls his soldiers, but on 3 August, while visiting wounded at a hospital near Nicosia, he is confronted with something else entirely: battle fatigue. Outraged that an enlisted man who left battle merely for psychological reasons would be housed with soldiers physically wounded, Patton curses a quaking private, slapping him and throwing him out of the hospital tent. On 5 August, Patton issues an order to all battle commanders that no more cases of battle fatigue are to be treated in hospitals under his command. Those who report for stress-related treatment, Patton says, should be court-martialed. It is an inhumane order. One of the well-kept secrets of the war is that the stress of fighting can cause as many casualties as bullets. As the 7th Army moves closer to Messina, the German resistance stiffens. General Omar Bradley conceives a series of amphibious landings behind enemy lines, leapfrogging the Nazis' entrenched positions. On 7 August, Bradley launches the first assault, hitting hard and forcing the defenders to abandon their positions. The main German force, however, escapes. On 10 August, with the second landing underway, Patton, clearly in a frenzy over the taking of Messina, stops at another hospital to visit another group of his brave men. Among them, he finds another case of battle fatigue. He slaps the soldier repeatedly before leaving to monitor Bradley's progress. The final push into Messina goes well. The city is isolated, and on 16 August, Bradley makes plans to have Major General Lucian Truscott, Jr., whose 3rd Division did much of the actual fighting, accept the city's surrender. On 17 August, however, Truscott stands by fuming as Patton leads the parade into the city. Patton enters the city convinced that he is at last triumphant. But in Algiers, Eisenhower receives his first reports of the soldier-slapping incidents. Ike, whose respect for Patton's abilities on the battlefield is essentially boundless, nonetheless decides that Patton needs a jacking up. He orders Patton to apologize not just to the soldiers involved, but to the hospital staffs that had witnessed the events. Patton does so, and apologizes to Eisenhower as well for causing him grief and difficulty. Back home, Press reports of the incidents create a groundswell of sentiment for Patton's expulsion from the army. Eisenhower, however, understands the brash tank commander's value to the war effort and has no intention of losing him for good. Still, there is little doubt that Patton's future is clouded. September 1943, Salerno, Italy. Just hours after the Italian surrender is announced over the wireless, men and equipment under the command of Lieutenant General Mark Clark are discharged from ships into the Bay of Salerno. The operation is codenamed Avalanche, a name that characterizes not only the operation's objective, but the Allies' self-assurance as well. Like the uncontrollable force of nature for which it is named, American and British troops will descend upon and hopefully bury the Nazis. Situated 35 miles southwest of Naples, Salerno is merely a stopping point in this landslide. With speed and surprise as the tactics, the plan imitates its title. However, 6 weeks of negotiations for the Italian surrender have bogged down Allied momentum and provided the Nazis time to prepare. Following the Casablanca Conference in January, the Allies declared that nothing short of unconditional surrender would be accepted from any of its enemies. The Italians, however, appeared not to have heard about Casablanca. Although Italy's new government, under the leadership of Pietro Badoglio, was perfectly willing to yield to the Allies, it also had certain conditions under which it would do so. Fearing Nazis stationed in Rome would react violently to news of a capitulation, Italy haggled for British and American protection of the Eternal City. While squabbling with the Allies, Badoglio also pandered to Hitler, telling him that their fascist union was insoluble. Hitler, however, considered Badoglio a spineless waste. His attention was focused instead on the Americans and British. Sensing Italy's impending betrayal, Hitler used the time provided by the dragging negotiations to stock Italy with his own forces. Finally, Allied commanders delivered an ultimatum to the Italians: surrender unconditionally or Rome would be mercilessly bombed. Badoglio, who favored neither the political doctrines of the Axis or the Allies, unconditionally surrendered on 3 September. Then, fearing German reprisals, he and Italian King Victor Emmanuel fled immediately to Brindisi. Despite the fact Italy is still swarming with Nazis, the Allied outlook is as high as the Alps. British commanders are predicting that the war will be over in a year. But German Field Marshal Albrecht Kesselring has very different ideas. He intends to contest the taking of each inch of Italy and has prepared his troops to do so. The Nazis easily overtake Italian defenses at Salerno. Huddled in dry machine gun nests high above the invasion zone, the Germans drive the Allies back into the chin-deep waters of the bay. Scores of men never again touch land, and those who do find themselves on a shallow beachhead trying to fight their way uphill, a motion not usually associated with an avalanche. Speed is no longer a factor in this operation. Soldiers are barely able to maneuver through the remains of their fallen comrades. Landing craft find they can't lower their ramps due to the buildup of dead bodies. For 2 days, the Germans fire on the men of Avalanche. The Allies make minor gains by taking a nearby airstrip, but even this small victory is negated when shells from German panzer units pound the strip into rubble. British troops under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, who are supposed to drive from the south and join with Clark's forces, instead remain mired at the rainy tip of Italy. Allied commanders have no answers to the Nazi pounding. Their forces are divided by Kesselring's troops. The beachheads won in the first days of the operation are now lost, and it seems as if Avalanche will subside into the sea. By 12 September, the Allies' situation is desperate. Both the British and the Americans have no reserves left, and every man capable of carrying a rifle is already fighting. On 15 September, help finally arrives as 3,500 men of the U.S. 82nd Airborne drift down like snowflakes, bringing much-needed reinforcement to the beleaguered avalanche. With the support of 2 additional British battleships and a massive increase in air support, the battle quickly turns in favor of the Allies. By the next day, the Germans realize they cannot hold and decide a change of tactics is in order. They draw back to new defensive positions, digging into the hills around Naples, preparing themselves to meet the victorious, albeit somewhat humbled, British and American forces. September 1943, central Italy. At the base of Gran Sasso, a mountain in the Abruzzi region of Italy, a group of German commandos gleefully celebrate their successful execution of a raid known as Operation Oak. Happier still is the beneficiary of the mission, Il Duce himself, Benito Mussolini. Having been ousted as dictator by political maneuvering and royal proclamation on 23 July, Mussolini was taken prisoner 2 days later and has been held under close guard until his liberation today. Moved several times during his captivity in order to evade any German rescue attempt, Mussolini was finally taken to a dismal hotel at the top of the 9,000-foot Gran Sasso and told to make himself comfortable. The Italians deemed the location safe because the only access was by cable car, and the control station at the foot of the mountain was heavily guarded. What they had not counted on was the daring and brilliance of Waffen-SS Captain Otto Skorzeny, who landed 80 commandos in 8 gliders near the peak of the mountain, while a second group battled to take the control station below. Despite being outnumbered nearly 2-to-1 by the Italian forces guarding the hotel, Skorzeny and his commandos were able to extract Il Duce without firing a shot. When the Italians saw the Germans charging up the hill, they hung a white bedsheet outside a window and handed the fallen fascist over without further ado. Now, along with Skorzeny, Mussolini boards a plane which will fly him to meet the man most responsible for his rescue, Adolf Hitler. Despite dissent, albeit muted dissent, among the Nazi hierarchy, Hitler had insisted on Mussolini's liberation. The relationship between the two men has always been more than political, and despite Il Duce's bumbling statesmanship and the Italian army's ineptitude, the Nazi leader holds his counterpart in high regard, for it was Mussolini's rise to power that Hitler used as a model for his own. In the 1920s, Mussolini founded the Fascist Party, and using the financial and social anarchy that plagued Italy as a springboard, catapulted himself to the top of the political heap. Hitler followed his lead and played the game perfectly, preying on the fears and hopes of a destitute Germany, using huge rallies, just as Mussolini had, to bolster the Nazi Party and gain control of the Reichstag. He maneuvered politically to convince President von Hindenburg to appoint him Chancellor and, on Hindenburg's death, seized complete control. While Hitler has certainly used his power in much more profound ways, it was Mussolini who blazed the trail, and the Nazi leader has never forgotten that. So it is that upon Il Duce's arrival in Rostenburg, Germany, on 15 September, the Führer is waiting, and the two greet each other with the warmth of friends reunited. They are joined by both Nazi and military leaders and enter into a series of meetings to decide how to restore Mussolini to power in Italy. But from the beginning of his visit, it is clear that this is not Il Duce of old. His eyes are that of a frightened child. He has clearly been overwhelmed by recent events and shows no signs of recovering the swagger and bombast that brought him to power. As the meetings conclude several days later, Mussolini boards a plane for Munich, where, in a radio broadcast, he will announce to the world the creation of a new government based in northern Italy and headed by himself. But in truth, he is incapable of running anything. It is Hitler and the Nazis who will call the shots for the newly created Salo Republic, with Mussolini purely a puppet of the German government. And so it is that Italy finds itself a nation torn asunder, with the Allies in charge in the south and the Nazis controlling the government in the north. Italy is occupied by two armies at war who are more concerned with serving their own purposes than protecting her best interests. It has become clear to all Italians that Il Duce, the leader, has led them down the road to defeat and ruin. 1st October 1943, the Italian front. The Allies at last enter Naples, the prize of Operation Avalanche. What they find is a smoldering, destroyed city with half of its population of 800,000 missing or murdered. Destroyed by the Nazis, this port town stands as a reflection of their barbaric legacy. As American Lieutenant General Mark Clark enters the city, he receives no hero's welcome. Neapolitan homes are tightly shuttered. All is desolate. After inflicting heavy casualties and holding the Americans up for nearly a week, the Nazis under General Wiedinghoff retreated from Salerno on 15 September. As the Germans withdrew, the Allies followed like dogs on the trail of a wounded rabbit. The clever Nazis, though, forced their enemy to detour, destroying every bridge and pass through the mountains. Allied infantry was made to forge through more hostile terrain, strewn with German mines and booby traps. Those soldiers, the insidious devices didn't take as victims. A German rear guard tried to. Allied troops were trapped in the hills as the main body of Wiedinghoff's force marched into Naples. Neapolitans staged a heroic civil resistance, but were no match for the battle-trained soldiers. The Germans destroyed waterworks, food stores, and granaries, leaving the people whom they did not kill to starve slowly. At the pinnacle of savagery, they torched the ancient University of Naples, gleefully turning books into bonfires. When the Allies finally reached the plains of Naples, the Germans again retreated, but their presence is still felt. A port so desperately needed by the Allies is useless, littered with debris and sunken ships. On 7 October, a German time bomb explodes in the post office, killing 70. On 11 October, another bomb claims 18 paratroopers and wounds 56 others. As Clark's troops pursue the Nazis north, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring establishes a defensive line east to west along the ankle of the country in the Apennines mountain range, which is moated by the flooded Volturno River. On the evening of 12 October, the Allies utilized log rafts and Navy pontoons to ford the swelling river. When dawn comes, however, the Germans begin to pick off the soldiers one by one. On 13 October, under heavy fire, an additional 2 regiments forced their way across the Volturno and attacked the Germans. Wiedinghoff praises the Allied movement as powerfully executed. He can afford to be gracious. Most of his men are safely tucked into the crags and outcrops of the Apennines, practically untouchable by aerial bombardment. Kesselring, well known for his incessant smiling, can't help but grin at his strategy, which has stymied the Allies and depleted their ranks. All the Germans need to do is defend the 2 plains at either end of their 120-mile-long defensive line. Although they have lost a Confederate in the Italians, they still have a powerful ally in Mother Nature. The rugged Italian mountains, coupled with the onset of winter, bode well for the entrenched defenders. For the Allies, it means there is still a very long road to Rome. 5 November 1943, Italy. If Allied commanders didn't realize before, they certainly now know that Field Marshal Albert Kesselring completely controls Nazi operations in Italy. Without fanfare or change of strategy, Kesselring replaces General Heinrich von Wiedinghoff, who is on a leave of absence, with Lieutenant General Joachim Lemelson as commander of German ground forces. Unfortunately, the Allies are not so unified under a single vision. Coordination between Lieutenant General Mark Clark, who is maneuvering the troops on the eastern side of Italy, and British General Bernard Montgomery on the Adriatic coast, barely exists. In fact, their armies appear to be fighting separate campaigns. As Montgomery's men have been inching inland, apparently to meet Clark, Clark's army has hardly advanced at all. Indeed, both in the east and the west in Italy, the Allies meander with continual offensives that tax their reserves of men and equipment, but make no real gains. In mid-October, the first Americans forged across the swollen Volturno River and headed north toward Rome. Blocking their way, however, were Kesselring's troops, firmly entrenched in the rocky Italian hills. At the start of the campaign, the German field marshal showed his commanders a map of southern Italy and pointed to each array of peaks within the Apennines Mountains. These ranges, he explained, would be the Nazi defenses. While the Nazis safely camped on the brows of the hills, Clark's troops pointlessly fired at their positions. The enemy, however, was unaffected and even downright disrespectful. They even waved and smiled at the frustrated Allies who futilely lobbed shell after shell at their mocking enemy, only to see the ammunition wasted. But the solid Barbara line was forsaken by Wiedinghoff, who withdrew his troops north to yet another range of rocky mountains that established the Bernhardt-Gustav line. Enraged, Kesselring publicly called Wiedinghoff a dummy. In his view, the withdrawal was premature and gave precious ground to the Allies without a fight. Wiedinghoff believed he was keeping to his commander's schedule and certainly didn't appreciate the name-calling he asked for and was granted a leave. In the meantime, Clark's troops pile into the Italian villages recently abandoned by the Germans. These towns, reduced to rubble by the Allied shelling, are now shelled anew by their former Nazi occupiers. Finally, in an attempt to break the deadlock, Clark orders his forces to take Mignano Gap, a tiny but treacherous section of Highway 6, the road that leads to Rome. The path zigzags up an extremely steep incline. At the top, entrenched and protected as always, are the Germans. Again and again, Allied infantry charge Mignano Gap and are repeatedly repelled. On 11 November, Clark's forces drive the Germans from a road adjoining Highway 6, but 2 days later, the Nazis answer that setback with a ferocious counterattack. All Allied personnel, including cooks and drivers, take up arms to defend the small road and, in a ghastly fight, hold it. While Clark's troops fight for the Roman road, Montgomery's 8th has pushed to the eastern portion of the Gustav line. There, he calls for his units to halt so he can regroup and develop his next plan of attack. While the commander considers his options, Kesselring decides the east is no longer worth defending and orders his troops there to withdraw to the ever-important Roman road. The arrival of these reinforcements to Highway 6 is not enough for Lieutenant General Lemelson, who knows they are weary from battling the British. He requests that the fresh troops who are guarding Rome be moved south to the Mignano Gap. Before the request can be answered, the fury of the battle at Mignano turns to silence. Clark tells Army Group Commander Sir Harold Alexander that his troops are worn to the ground, and that even if they do take Mignano Gap, they probably wouldn't be able to hold it. Alexander agrees and a ceasefire is ordered. In 2 weeks, Allied commanders promise the push for the Bernhardt-Gustav line will resume. Once German resistance is smashed, their armies will claim their prize and march victoriously through the streets of Rome. While the American foot soldier driving through Italy has had to fight tooth and nail for every inch of ground wrested from the Nazis, there are some comforts which help to ease the miseries inherent in war. Perhaps the greatest of these joys can be found in the faces of the enthusiastically grateful Italians. In many of the towns won by the Allies, citizens have poured into the streets celebrating their newly won freedom and the men who helped to win it. Although the GIs were greeted with similar adulation in liberated cities during the North African campaign, it is different here in Italy. In Africa, the soldiers found a culture quite different from their own. Italian culture, on the other hand, is woven into the very fabric of American society. Indeed, for many Italian Americans, the peaceful times between battles breed a feeling of homecoming. Many of these soldiers are actually permitted the opportunity to visit with relatives long missed or never seen. Further adding to the simple pleasures of Italy are the kids. The GIs, some just barely adults themselves, delight in playing with the young Italians. Men with families can see in the bright young eyes of Italy reflections of their own children back home. Time spent with these innocents soothes the soul and reminds the men what they're fighting to protect. While many things in Italy ring with familiarity, the fact remains that it is a foreign country and retains a certain alien quality. This is not offsetting, however. Rather, the cultural differences found here seem exotic and make certain citizens thoroughly alluring. Back on the line, many soldiers are working with reminders of home life in the form of mules. Thousands of these stubborn beasts of burden have been sent from America to carry supplies through the treacherous landscape of Italy. Joining the donkey is the ever-popular dog. Sickly strays roam the Italian countryside, and when they cross a GI's path, adoption attempts are inevitable. While Italy has involved some of the hardest fighting yet seen in this war, the rewards it offers to the men doing the fighting are more tangible than elsewhere. Cities are no longer mere abstract objectives on a general's map, but places that offer a mixture of the foreign and the familiar. And when the soldiers move on to their next objective, they march out, warmed by the memories of a land of friends, old and new. 20 November 1943, the Sangro River, Italy. General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army struggles in what has become an all-too-familiar picture in the Mediterranean theater. Yes, it's mud again. A half-mile of the gooey stuff bulging from the banks of the river. But try as she might, Mother Nature cannot completely stop the war machine. Soldiers dump railroad ties, trees, and steel matting to solidify the ground, allowing them to reach the river's bank. At the flooding river, Montgomery's engineers take up their unenviable positions. Under intense enemy fire, they construct a bridge, and the Army once again begins to roll forward. Once forward units have crossed the swollen river, a vicious battle erupts as Montgomery's soldiers tear into the German 65th Division. When word gets back to German headquarters, Major General Siegfried Westphal is told the 65th no longer exists. With a giant gap in their defenses, Kesselring's forces are in danger of being cut off, and a division from northern Italy and another from Mignano Gap scurry to fill the hole. Meanwhile, Montgomery watches as the newly constructed bridge is washed away by the rain-swollen Sangro. The advance grinds to a halt, permitting the Germans to fortify their weak defenses. But with or without bridges, Montgomery knows he must push on to participate in a newly devised Allied strategy to take Rome. For 2 months, American Lieutenant General Mark Clark's army has been battling west of Montgomery in the mountains south of Rome. On 13 November, however, Clark halted the assault and ordered a 2-week rest for his troops, who were exhausted, suffering heavy losses and gaining very little ground. This reprieve couldn't have come at a better time, as the weather has been at its worst. The break has also allowed Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean Theater, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Army Group Commander Sir Harold Alexander to rethink their strategy. The new plan, Operation Shingle, calls for a major amphibious landing at Anzio, southeast of Rome. While the Germans are distracted there, Clark is to push up from the south and Montgomery from the east. Before this operation can begin, Montgomery, whose troops have been bogged down since the beginning of the campaign, must fight his way closer to Rome. It is a thankless job, but one crucial to Shingle's success. So Montgomery, despite his lost bridges, despite the rain and mud, and despite the Nazis' newly repaired defenses, orders the battle to resume. On 3 December, divisions take their positions along the Sangro's banks. The fighting is tough, particularly for the 78th Division, which has already lost 10,000 men in the past 6 months. Ordered to take Ortona, the 78th charges the German defenses, but are twice repelled. On 7 December, they shift the focus of their attack to Orsonia, 10 miles west of Ortona. Once again, the fighting is fierce, and once again, the British are foiled. Unable to advance, the division alters its strategy. Instead of trying to overrun Orsonia, they bypass it. The Nazis, fearing they may be surrounded, abandon the city. But Ortona still is held by the Germans. Montgomery commands the 1st Canadian Division to dismantle the enemy's stronghold. 2 horrible weeks of house-to-house fighting results in mind-staggering casualties for the Canadians as well as for the Nazis. But finally, Ortona falls. So Montgomery has moved forward, but it is not enough. The rain in the mountains has turned to snow, and a head count shows him seriously short of men, and the soldiers he does have are on the verge of collapse. Still, he must take Pescara to the north. It is the lock that must be broken to pass through the back door to Rome. 16 January 1944, Central Italy. General Mark Clark confers with 5th Army commanders on the upcoming offensive against Germany's vaunted Gustav Line. Protecting the southern passes into the Liri Valley, the Gustav is the last obstacle between the Allies and a wide-open march to Rome, and Clark is determined to breach it. The key to doing that is the town of Cassino, anchor of the German positions. Cassino is dominated by a 900-foot rise which commands the wide valley before it. Atop the rise is Monte Cassino, a Benedictine monastery which the Allies fear the Germans will use to level artillery fire on the valley below. Reaching the German defenses will be no easy task, as they are fronted by the Rapido and Garigliano rivers. Clark's commanders, remembering all too well the difficulties encountered at the rain-swollen Volturno, are wary of another forced crossing into the teeth of German defenses. Acknowledging the risks, Clark orders that the attack begin. On 17 January, 3 divisions of the British 10th Corps launched their attack across the Garigliano. In the center and on the left flank, the assault troops quickly cross the river and establish a beachhead. On the right flank, however, spirited resistance by the 14th Panzer Corps foils the Brits, who are unable to gain a foothold. On the 18th, with 2 British divisions firmly established on the north shore of the Garigliano, German commanders order reserve units stationed near Anzio to move south to meet the attack. On 20 January, Clark orders the U.S. Second Corps to join the fray, and the men of the 36th Division launch their attack across the Rapido near San Angelo. Things go disastrously wrong from the start. Attacking across a 4-mile wide plain with both flanks exposed, the men of the Texas Division are subjected to withering machine gun and mortar fire. Assault boats, riddled with shell holes, sink in the rain-swollen river. The scattered groups who manage to reach the north bank are quickly wiped out by swift, sharp counterattacks. The German artillery that had worried Allied commanders ceaselessly pounds the assault troops, throwing them into disarray. The attack quickly loses all cohesion, and confusion reigns supreme. By nightfall, it is clear the attack has failed. Despite the tremendous cost, Clark is determined to gain a foothold on the far bank of the Rapido, and orders the 36th to try again on the morning of the 21st. Again, the Germans have little problem repulsing the attack, and by evening, the 36th Division has lost almost 1,700 men, dead, wounded, or missing. The attack is called off. Unable to bull through the heavy defenses at San Angelo, Clark decides to attempt a crossing north of Cassino, where the Rapido is wider and shallow enough to wade. The job falls to the veteran 34th Division and the French Expeditionary Corps. On 24 January, the men of the Red Bull Division launched their attack. Despite difficulty in getting heavy armor across in support of the infantry, the crossings are a success. Once on the north bank, however, the Americans again run into trouble. German minefields and concentrated artillery fire take a heavy toll on the already undermanned 34th. Stone farmhouses, turned into fortified pillboxes, slow the advance and inflict heavy casualties. Upstream from the 34th, the French troops under General Alphonse Juin have successfully crossed the river at Monte Belvedere, 5 miles north of Cassino. Driving north into the hills, Juin hopes to turn the German right flank and drive west into the Liri Valley. Despite a difficult uphill fight, by 3 February, the Americans take Monte Castellone, north of Cassino. On the 12th, unwilling to give up the strategic high ground, the Nazis launch a vicious counterattack. This time, however, it is the Germans who suffer the brunt of the battle. Artillery fire earmarked for the entrenched Americans falls short of its target and kills scores of the Wehrmacht soldiers. The Americans, for once controlling the high ground, take full advantage of their position and rake the advancing Germans with machine gun and small arms fire. By nightfall, the Germans withdraw. Although it has come at a tremendous cost, Clark now has his foothold on the north bank of the Rapido. Now he must find a way to dislodge the Germans from Cassino. It is clear that a frontal assault would be suicide. From their lofty position, the Germans could easily blunt any attack before it began. For now, he will wait and allow Second Corps to lick its wounds, content in the knowledge that he is tying up German units that are badly needed to the north. 22 January 1944, Anzio, Italy. In an operation that has been the topic of heated debate in the Allied leadership, American and British troops under the command of Major General John Lucas go ashore at this vital port 30 miles south of Rome. Surprisingly, resistance is virtually non-existent, and by the end of the day, over 36,000 troops, mostly from the American 3rd and British 1st Divisions, have landed, suffering only 13 casualties. While Lucas is pleased with the initial success, he is still wary of the operation as a whole. In fact, there are many Allied commanders who feel the landing is doomed to failure. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, however, believes it will shatter the entire German 14th Panzer Corps and propel the Allies into Rome. After months of tempestuous debate, Churchill managed to convince his Allied counterparts to attempt the ambitious operation. As Churchill envisioned the plan, General Mark Clark's assault on the Gustav Line would draw German reserves south from Rome, after which Lucas' 6th Corps was to land at Anzio, drive inland into the Alban Hills, thereby cutting German supply and communication routes. Although that is how Field Marshal Harold Alexander described the plan to Clark, Clark was less ambitious in his directive to Lucas. Fearing the Germans would be well entrenched in the Alban Hills and launch a deadly counterattack, Clark warned Lucas not to stick his neck out, but rather to seize and secure a beachhead at Anzio. That is exactly what Lucas intends to do. Instead of exploiting the opportunity to drive inland against such light resistance, his concern is with getting the rest of his corps ashore and establishing defensive positions. The Germans, meanwhile, are wasting no time in reacting to the landings. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring immediately begins to move troops from northern Italy, France, and the Balkans to contain the Anzio beachhead. Hitler dispatches Colonel General Eberhard von Mackensen, a distinguished veteran of the Eastern Front, to destroy the abscess south of Rome for the honor of the Wehrmacht. In Hitler's eyes, it is crucial that the Anzio landing be an unmitigated disaster for the Allies. His concern is not only keeping American and British troops from marching into Rome, but to discourage the Allied leadership from launching an amphibious operation against the coast of France. In London, Churchill is livid. In his eyes, the operation is failing simply due to Lucas' lack of drive. He complains to Alexander, "I expected to see a wildcat roaring into the mountains, and what do I find? A whale wallowing on the beaches." Meanwhile, at Anzio, Lucas continues to cautiously expand his beachhead, and German resistance begins to stiffen. In fact, in just over a week, the Germans have transferred 8 top-notch divisions into the area. By 30 January, Lucas is in striking distance of his first major target, the city of Cisterna on Highway 7. The assault, led by American Rangers, is a disaster. Cisterna, which was thought to be lightly defended, is in fact crawling with German paratroops. Vicious house-to-house fighting ensues, and the Americans are cut to pieces. By the end of the day, all but 6 of these 767 Rangers are dead or captured. Lucas is forced to call off the attack and orders his 6th Corps to set up a defensive perimeter. The Allies now have over 70,000 troops ashore at Anzio and more than 350 tanks. The Germans, however, have some 90,000 troops determined to contain and smash the beachhead. Although Lucas is under fire from Churchill and others in the Allied leadership for his lack of drive, he is certain that his actions have been prudent. Had he driven inland at a rapid pace, his lines would have been easily severed by a German counterattack, and the beachhead would have been crushed. As it is, he holds a solid position that is tying up 8 German divisions that could be helping on the Gustav Line to the south. For now, he will sit, wait, and hope that Mark Clark's 5th Corps can break the stalemate at Cassino and relieve his position. Then, he and Clark will march triumphantly through the streets of Rome. 14 February 1943, Anzio, Italy. Isolated and surrounded by 90,000 crack German troops and with no relief in sight, the men of General John Lucas' 6th Corps continue to strengthen their defensive positions in preparation for the attack they know will come. Already, the Germans have begun pounding the beachhead with their heavy artillery, the largest of which is a 280mm railroad gun that the GIs have dubbed Anzio Annie. With a 65-foot barrel, the gun is able to lob its massive shells as far as 36 miles, a feat unmatched by any piece of artillery in the Allied arsenal. The German guns fire day and night. The sheer randomness of the carnage begins to sap the morale of the Allied troops. Commanders struggle to steel their relatively green troops to the realities of modern warfare. On 15 February, the Luftwaffe escalates the attack on the Allied beachhead. Scores of bombers and fighters attack shore installations and incoming supply ships. Despite their success in sinking the Liberty ship Elihu Yale, the Luftwaffe suffers heavy losses. The Allies' radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire maintains a seamless umbrella of flak over the beachhead, which keeps all but the most daring of German pilots at bay. On 16 February, German General Eberhard von Mackensen unleashes the full fury of his forces on what Hitler refers to as the abscess south of Rome. Attacking south from the city of Aprilia, he throws the full weight of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division against the American 45th Division. The fighting is savage. The Germans have at their disposal new Panther and Tiger tanks with 88mm guns capable of outdueling any Allied tank. The men of the Thunderbird Division give ground, but they refuse to give up in the face of the onslaught. Heroic stands by small groups of men slow the Nazi advance. The giant German tanks bog down in the soft earth, and Allied bazookas and anti-tank guns begin to take their toll. American ground attack aircraft also give Mackensen headaches. Buzzing around the treetops, searching for targets of opportunity, they severely limit the Germans' mobility and ravage their communications. Determined to break the Americans, Mackensen commits his Infantry Lair Regiment to the fray. Although they are green, the Infantry Lair has been touted as one of the best trained units in the German army. Mackensen is confident that they will plow right through the exhausted 45th. He soon learns otherwise. Though the Lair may look sharp on the parade ground, in battle they are outmatched by the shabby dog faces of the 45th. Under heavy fire, seeing their comrades killed and wounded, the highly touted men of the Infantry Lair turn tail and run. The fighting continues unabated through the night. The Americans give ground in small pieces, exacting a high price from the attackers. By the morning of the 17th, they have fallen back to a defensive position the GIs called Dead End Road. Exhausted, their ranks dangerously depleted, they are less than 1 mile from the beaches. They have no option but to fight, and they do. Throughout the day, they repulse the Nazi attacks. Mackensen begins to realize that he will be unable to erase the abscess south of Rome. By the 19th, the Americans have regrouped and pushed the Germans back until they are over 1 mile from Dead End Road. 3 days of fighting, the Germans have suffered over 2,500 casualties, with some of their battalions whittled down to 150 men. On 22 February, although he has withstood everything the Germans have thrown at him, General Lucas is replaced as commander of 6th Corps by General Lucian Truscott. British General Harold Alexander, while acknowledging that the stand at Anzio has been heroic, feels that Lucas is tired and lacks the drive to break out of the beachhead and proceed to Rome. Now it is up to Truscott and his commanders to find a way to break the German encirclement and push into the Alban Hills. Before he can do that, however, he must give his troops, particularly the battered 45th, a chance to regroup. For now, he will wait, secure in the knowledge that the beachhead at Anzio will not fall. 5 June 1944, Rome. Arriving triumphantly, commander of the Fifth Army, General Mark Clark, parades through the town, claiming his mantle as liberator of the Eternal City. Clark's success in capturing Rome is a direct result of competition with his British and French counterparts. Since the breakouts at Anzio and Cassino, Allied commanders have directed a great deal of their attention to the race for Rome. Commander of ground forces in Italy, General Sir Harold Alexander's initial plan for Operation Diadem called for Clark's Fifth Army to throw itself into the pursuit, encirclement, and destruction of the German 10th Army at Valmontone. Instead, Clark shifted just enough of his troops to that mission in order not to be insubordinate, but threw the weight of his army northward. For the past week, they have been fighting their way up Highway 6 just ahead of their British counterparts for the glory of liberating Rome. French troops under General Alphonse Juin have also been involved in the competition. Their purpose in getting to the Eternal City first was to reach Pope Pius XII and deliver a message from Charles de Gaulle. Disgusted by the pontiff's endorsement of the Vichy government, he wished to explain to the Pope why he should throw his support behind the Free French. On 2 June, Pius XII made a public statement, a warning of sorts to those who might turn Rome into a battleground. He spoke of God's judgment against those who would harm the Eternal City. The next day, wary of losing more public support after the bombing fiasco at Cassino, the Allies made a radio broadcast. Mediterranean Theater Commander General Henry Jumbo Wilson said that Rome would be turned into a battleground only if the Germans used it for military advantage. On 3 June, Hitler finally decided that his troops would be better able to make a stand north of Rome and gave the order for their withdrawal from the city. Early in the morning of 4 June, French units found themselves the targets of a strafing run by American fighters. Enraged, General Juin believed that the attack was a deliberate attempt to stop the French advance. But the planes had also strafed American columns that they had mistaken for German. That same day, General Clark himself came under attack. Machine gunners of Kesselring's rear guard, hidden in a church 5 miles outside the city, opened fire in the direction of Clark and a few other generals. The attack ended quickly, however, as the Germans were too far from the officers to truly pose a threat. On 4 June, the last German troops withdrew from Rome. Even as they trickled out of the north side of town, the Allies began pouring in from the south, transferring possession of the city almost without seeing one another. This triumphant arrival of Allied troops in an Axis capital, the first such event of the war, was greeted initially by only empty streets. As the troops continued to pour into the city, however, Roman civilians began to fill the streets, joyously greeting their liberators. The transfer is made official when Clark parades through the streets. Although he has succeeded in securing the first Axis capital of the war, it has been at a great cost. In refusing to pursue the 10th Army, Clark has passed up the opportunity to crush a large portion of Germany's strength in Italy in order to bask in the light of conquest. Ultimately, the importance of this strategic failure can only be measured when the value of the morale boost provided by the seizure of Rome has been determined. The city does offer a concrete sense of accomplishment, but there is a lingering sense that even though the Allies have their trophy, Most of the battle remains to be fought. "24 April 1945, Milan, Italy. The end has come for Il Duce and his mistress, and he, at least, has been expecting it. Ever since his arrest in July 1943, Benito Mussolini has known how his people feel about him. They hate him. Mussolini's dreams of being a world leader have led Italy to suffer a humiliating rout in Greece, devastating losses in North Africa, and the worst, the enslavement of Italians to work in German fields and factories. Over the winter, his boyhood home at Forlì has been sacked by local residents and captured by the Allies during their advance on Bologna. Bands of partisans, mostly Italian communists with some Italian socialists thrown in, roam the countryside looking to drive Mussolini's fascists and the Germans out of Italy. Mussolini spent the winter holed up at Lake Garda, watched by the German ambassador to Italy, Rudolf Rahn. Mussolini escaped Rahn only once, last December, when he managed to make a public appearance in Milan. He spoke before a carefully selected fascist audience which cheered him, but still Mussolini had to travel back to Lake Garda like a prisoner. Afterwards, he began to speak frequently of death. But his hope of surviving the war was renewed somewhat in March, when he learned that the Allies were within 60 miles of Berlin and also massing south of Bologna. But after a week, Mussolini realized it would be dangerous to stay in Milan. First, Bologna fell, and then the Allies crossed the Po River. Allied planes strafed the streets of Milan, and partisan forces mass in the city. That evening, Mussolini leaves for Como, followed by several armed bands, and Clara Petacci, his mistress. Both Mussolini and the Germans accompanying him have tried to convince her this is a bad idea, but Clara, who has been infatuated with Mussolini since she was a child, refuses to listen. The two are waylaid and executed by partisans, as are 15 other fascists traveling with them. The next day, all the bodies, including Mussolini's and Petacci's, are loaded into a moving van and trucked back to Milan, where they are dumped in a square by a filling station. Men and women throng the square to demonstrate their exact feelings for Mussolini. Soon the crowd is howling, jeering, hissing, spitting. They rush to the bodies to show their fury over Italy's futile sacrifices in the war. Someone even fires shots into Mussolini's corpse. As the frenzy of hate grows worse, a church official intervenes to keep the crowd from tearing the bodies to pieces. The bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and others are hung up by their heels. A partisan, concerned about decency, pins Clara's skirt between her legs. After dark, Allied authorities remove the bodies. Mussolini is buried in a Milan cemetery. Italy's 23 years under fascism and its charismatic strongman have finally come to an end.
We're here today to commemorate and really pay homage to the 80th anniversary of the landings at Nettuno and Anzio. As a member of the 1st Armored Division, our formation was a part of that operation. It's breathtaking to be here, to see firsthand the cost and the price that so many paid to liberate Italy.
We're here celebrating the memorial at a Sicily, Rome American Cemetery Memorial. I'm here with 3 other paratroopers. We are a firing party at this time, rendering honors for this wreath ceremony.
It is an honor to be down here in Sicily, Rome. It's a very powerful stage that is set here before us, and it makes us very honored to be able to attend to such a detail. We thank everyone who invited us, and we thank everyone who was able to put this together.